I'm so grateful for this tremendous turnout and for the panel of people who made presentations to us today and who will make presentations this afternoon and tomorrow. We've got a thoroughgoing bunch of experts here, and it shows. I'd like to make another comment. Dr. Seifert, who's seated here on the front row, introduced me to Jim Butler, who is the sculptor of the memorial in France that has been mentioned and that was pictured a moment ago. On the 10th of this month, a sculpture that Jim Butler did of the Queen of England was dedicated at Runnymede and is a part of the memorial celebration of the Magna Carta. This is a great compliment to Jim Butler, great compliment to Dr. Seifert, who's the one who introduced me to Jim. Going back further, I'd met Dr. Seifert about 20 years ago when we served together on a board, an archaeological board in Jerusalem, Israel, and I'd never seen her, and she showed up, and I was there, and I told her, well, I knew she's French, good-looking French, and I said, well, my old man was in France and had great affection for the country, and I spoke to her about Croisilles Farm, about which I knew next to nothing, and I said, I really would like to learn where he was wounded and something about his career. And so she is in France several times every year, and I heard from her, and she said that she had located the Croisilles Farm, the remains of the fortified farmhouse there, and so I went and saw it, and it had a house trailer on it, a beat-up house trailer and an abandoned car, and a shoddy cottage that had been constructed after World War II. It had a pristine remnant of this 17th century fortified farmhouse that was there and in good shape. It was a 3.5 acre tract of land, and business was good then. This was before Lehman collapsed, and I said, well, maybe we should buy it. And then she comes back and says, well, it's not that simple. It's got 3 owners and one's an Arab. And we were at a real inflection point on our relationships with the Arab world at that time. But I said, well, please do see if you can buy it. And so 3 years later, you haven't lived until you bought real estate in France. So 3 years later, we owned it. And I owned it. And I'd put up we created the foundation to purchase it. And I had it, I didn't know what to do with it. Who could you give it to? Who could do something constructive with it? And so I said, well, okay, Monique, let's just think about putting up a memorial there. And so she introduced me to Butler, and I had also seen the works of and spoken with a couple of other renowned sculptors. I was determined to get the best sculptor that we could get for this project. I'd never been in philanthropy in my life. I'm a pretty tight guy, and I'd never given anything away. I'd never memorialized the old man in any way. And we bought it, and I'd seen Butler's 3 of his great works of art. And so we hired Butler, and then he came up with what he called, I said it's the Rainbow Paita. I named it. He said, no, I'm not a religious man. He said, we can't call it the Paita. But he had such a great figure there of that dead soldier with that torn shoe. and with those puttees. It was just such a great dead man. And I said, Butler, I've seen dead American soldiers. And they all look like rag dolls. And that's what you've done here. You've given us a rag doll. And I think it's a great piece of art, and it's a great compliment to our state to have its name, the 167th Alabama Infantry, on the side of that memorial, the 42nd Rainbow Division on the front of it, Will Frazer's name on the back. It's a great thing for me to have been able to participate in this thing, and I thank you publicly, Dr. Seaford, but for you, I would be a lot richer. Okay, I have a paper here called Notable Combat Soldiers from Alabama in World War I. The 167th U.S. Infantry Regiment was created by Secretary of War Baker from the 1st, 2nd, and 4th Alabama Militia regiments, and the 2nd Cavalry was in it. It was a piddling little cavalry outfit, but it was there. This force of 3,677 officers and men received advanced training. All of them, as Ruth pointed out earlier, and I have to say this as an aside also, that Dr. Truss and Marty Olaf here, both of them well-established PhDs, are the only two people from the Alabama academic world who have written about World War I and the Rainbow Division and the 167th Infantry in the modern era, and I thank you both for your work, which was done before mine. Anyhow, Ruth's got, I go to their sources to get the correct numbers for Ruth, but I have checked them, and they're good. They went to the Mexican border in fall of October 1916 and came back in March of 1917 during the punitive expedition, where they did not fire a single shot in anger, but they did receive some pretty good advanced infantry training for 4.5 months. How do I do this? There we go. It's a payday down there on the Mexican border in silver, and that picture on the right is the one that is more recently taken that give you some idea of the terrain on which these guys operated. This is Bill Screws. Ruth's already mentioned him, and I'd like to ask his grandchildren to stand, please. Joe Screws McGowan and John Screws. Screws had been to the Philippines twice. One tour as a combat soldier, and once he's president of a military district of Malabang. When he came back after his second tour, there was no place in the regular army for anybody to get a company command or battalion command if they were not West Pointers. He was not a West Pointer. He'd gone to Marion for 1 year, was on the honor roll one time. He was a bright guy. He was a very professional kind of guy. He was straight up, stood up straight. He was quick to chew guys out. He set a high standard. His idea was that every one of these National Guardsmen should perform and appear to be as if they were regular army. So these outfits scattered all over the state. He visited them all, inspected them. He'd written officers' efficiency reports on every single officer in the Alabama National Guard prior to its mobilization, and he had looked into the eyes of every one of these soldiers in inspection and ranks. He knew these people pretty well. When they came back from the from the Mexican border. The regiment was mobilized into the 167th by Secretary of War Baker, and the table of organization and efficiency was capped at 3,770. He picked those men. He knew who to pick. There were about a little over 5,000 to pick from, and he picked the best, 3,677, that he took on to New York. At Camp Mills, they became a part of the Rainbow Division. As Ruth has told you, they were brigaded with our regiment into the 84th Brigade, and the Ohio and New York, Ohio 168th and 166th, and the New York 165th were in the 83rd Brigade. Douglas MacArthur was Division Chief of Staff. He'd played a role in the beginning. He'd worked for the head of the militia division of the War Department when they had decided to create another regular Army division, another division, a National Guard division, and he'd been involved in the creation of the 1st Division when they cherry-picked regular Army units from all over the regular Army bases, posts, to go into the 1st Division. So he told Secretary of War Baker, we can do the same thing out of the National Guard units. They've all been they've all had advanced training, and he went through the list, and they chose units from 26 states of the nation to go in and be a part of the 42nd Division, and he was right there and was a part of naming it the Rainbow Division. Some newspaper reporter said, what are we going to call it? And somebody said, well, it's just like a rainbow. It covers the United States, and that's where it got its name. And that was the beginning of MacArthur's experience with him. That was a big deal. A lot of this I got from the prejudices of my old man, but he thought MacArthur was a great man. And you'd hear this talk, the assembling during World War II about Dugout Doug, that hey, it was down. He would, he'd left Corregidor and gone down, ratted out down to Australia, and he was in a dugout while all these other guys were getting shot at. And I asked the old man, I said, did you ever see Douglas MacArthur in a combat situation? And he said, yeah, I saw him. And I have to add to Marty and Ruth that I've really looked hard to find this stated somewhere else in the literature, and it's nowhere else in the literature, so you just got to take my word for it, which is taking Will's word for it. But he said he saw Douglas MacArthur about 11 o'clock on the morning of the battle at Croisilles Farm. It had an arduous trip from Lafayette near Chateau Thierry all night long on solid rubber tired trucks, no sleep. Got into an area 6 or 7 miles from Croisilles Farm. It was under artillery fire. I pulled out and hit the road. The 3 battalions ready to go to war. The Germans were shooting at them. The New Englanders had lost about half of their force up there in the previous 10 days or so, and the terrain was littered with dead Americans and dead Germans as these guys went into that battle. It's important for you to realize that these were not rookies at that point. Having arrived in France quite early, they were one of the winter divisions. They were the 1st Division, the 2nd Division, the New England National Guard, and the 42nd Rainbow were the 4 winter divisions that were all we had in Europe during that winter. And things were very dicey with the British and with the French. I think I would say that I believe they were dicier than Dr. Seifert had indicated. The British were drafting the Irish. The French had lost 1 million men dead 1 million men dead, and we were just going into that battle, going into that war. That's one thing I wanted to tell you, that the British and French, in my opinion, had been pretty well drained white by the time President Wilson committed us to that war and got some troops over there who could do some good. So it was very important that we get through that winter as best we could without fighting some major battles. There were a lot of complaints from the French and the British that we'd gotten troops on the continent of Europe and we were not helping them with the war. And that's just the way it was. I mean, the French had asked for a full-form combat division, and we didn't have one outside of those 4 that were there, and Wilson and Pershing were unwilling to turn those over to the French. The British wanted 75 battalions to put into the trenches with their troops, and that wasn't going to happen. This exhibit here will give you some idea of the mobility of this Alabama regiment. They had 73 different command posts in 10 months. It was a highly mobile unit. If you watch television, if you watch all of these common sense depictions of that war, you'd think it was all trench warfare. Well, it wasn't. It wasn't for the Americans. Pershing knew that if we were ever going to get to the Rhine River, we couldn't do it in 3-mile increments. It had to be a highly mobile operation. So when he got these troops onto the ground in France, with his usual good sense, he named a guy named Robert Lee Bullard from Lee County, Alabama, who was in the class at West Point ahead of him. Pershing knew Bullard. Pershing, incidentally, was 22 years old when he went to West Point. I mean, he was a full-grown man when he got there. He was not a boy, and he never showed much distinction at West Point. He wasn't that good a speaker. He certainly wasn't that good a scholar. But he knew how to take names and how to get people to produce. And during that experience, he had soldiered with Robert Lee Bullard. Bullard was from Lee County. He was a country boy. Family didn't have any money. They'd been landowners. They were land poor. The examination for West Point was extremely competitive, and he went to Auburn, paid Auburn $150 to keep him there for a year, wore his ROTC uniform every day. He was totally committed. He won the competitive examination, got to West Point, and that is where he fell in with Pershing. After they got to France, and Pershing said, Bullard, I want you to be in charge of training of all of our people here. We're going to train in mobile warfare, and we're going to do specialty weapons trainings with the French. We'll use the French facilities and French trainers as much as we can, but we don't want to be colored by their thinking. Their thinking is trench warfare. Our thinking is mobile warfare. And so when they get there, they go down to well, let's see. I'll just show you. You see Strasburg over to the right-hand corner. That's Lorraine. That's Alsace-Lorraine. That was the one piece of it that was kind of kept out of the war in the early stages of the war. The Germans had come through at Baccarat and tore it up a little bit, and then the French retook it and held it throughout the entire war. So it was used by the French as a training facility. it was an easy sector. The Germans would send their beat-up soldiers down there, and the French would send their beat-up soldiers down there, and they'd kind of have a truce. They'd patrol every night, but nobody was pushing anybody around very much. So then Bullard brings this force of 4 divisions up to a standard so that they can be placed into various sectors that do involve trenches. The 42nd went into this sector down in Lorraine at Baccarat. There was never a major offensive down there by either the Germans or ourselves during this period. They were there for 110 days. After about 30 days, they were given responsibility for the sector. And MacArthur viewed it as a training situation. I mean, you go to Mitch's archives and you'll see these signed orders down there up there at College Park, Maryland, by MacArthur, saying that we're going to have one element on the front, one element in support, and a third element in reserve. And that was the way that everybody was going to serve. And for every battalion that was on the front, then they were going to have a patrol out every single night. And there were very, very few exceptions. You could probably get an exception if you were the regimental surgeon or if you were a regimental commander, but this was a routine, a training routine that was hard duty. You could get killed. It was extremely dangerous. We were losing men. We were making long-range patrols, quite long-range patrols. The Alabama Regiment made the longest-range penetration that had ever been made during the war in one of those patrols. So when that thing was over, when that 110 days was up, they were being pulled out, and the guys all thought they were going to get in some more training, but that wasn't going to happen. Dr. Seifert mentioned the collapse of the Tsar's army, and when freed up 62 divisions of Germans that were moved from the Eastern Front to the Western Front to make its last attempt to penetrate 55 miles into the city of Paris. If the Germans had ever gotten to Paris, the war was over. End of story. And I have to say 62 divisions, the Germans called a division about what we would call a regiment, so those weren't real divisions by our standards, but they were beefed up regimental combat teams is what they really were, and they were very, very good. I mean, the Germans by this stage of the game had a lot of experience. They knew they were running out of time. They knew that there were 30,000 new Americans coming in every single month. If they were going to take Paris, they had to do it, and they had to do it then, on that bite of the apple. So the Rainbow Division was moved from Lorraine back up to the Champagne. They were there for about 2 weeks waiting for the attack. Will said it was the most welcome thing they'd ever had. They'd come out of these trenches for 110 days, and there they were in July weather. It was dry, and they could get rid of those bed bugs and vermin that they were all covered with, and they could get a little French wine, and so they waited for about, and they stayed under camouflage all day, every day, so they didn't have to work. And they just knew that the German airplanes were coming overhead trying to figure out where they were, and all getting ready for this big assault that was going to take place on the 15th of July. A lot of great Alabama stories that come out of that. Borden Burr, which is a very well-known Birmingham name. Borden Burr that played football at Alabama. He was a lawyer, really from Sylacauga, but he'd gone to Birmingham. I guess his law business wasn't too much, so he thought he'd get in on he's kind of an adventurer. That was his whole life, was looking for a thrill. And he signed up for a short tour with the YMCA. And they sent him over there, and it was right while they were waiting for that battle at the Champagne. Bordenburg goes in to see Bill Screws and reports to him, and Screws says, all right, well, you know some of these guys. He knew Captain Green from Pell City, who later got himself killed. And he knew a lot of these. He knew, Mortimer Jordan. Those guys were all hanging around Birmingham together. They all knew each other, and all from the same kind of class of people. So anyhow, the balloon goes up and the Germans come across. It's a great piece of strategy. Buy my book and you can see what it was. This guy, Garou, was a well-known French general. He was a tough guy, a fighter. He had a half of a leg and a half of an arm, and anyhow, he gave him a stirring rendition. I mean, on 2 days before, he said, "In your hearts, you live as free men, and we're going to fight here. We're going to fight, and we're going to fight until they've had enough." I mean, it was really Hollywood kind of stuff that Garou was giving them, and he'd pulled in all of the American regimental commanders and had a big dinner for them on 2 nights before the fight. And so then they get down to the wire, and Screws and MacArthur get Joe, I can't remember that guy's name. Marjorie Allen's lover. Everett Jackson. Everett Jackson from Montgomery was the first lieutenant. He'd never done anything distinctive in his life, but for some reason Screws puts him in the center of the German penetration, and the maps are there in the book that I'm sure you're going to buy and enjoy. And it's a hell of a fight. I mean, it really is a hell of a fight. And the Germans come in, and there's a false front, and then they have to go through an open area, and then there's another fight, and then there's a fallback to a last ditch, and they all agreed that if the last ditch gets penetrated, then the command of the 42nd Division switches from the 4th French Army to the United States Army. I mean, they were all prepared for a worst case, and they won. And there was a lot of good stuff there, a lot of great heroism. One guy shot down a German airplane with a rifle, and, just good stuff. And the second day, and there's some counterattacks. The 1st and the 3rd battalions of the 42nd were not on the point. They were one step back on each flank, and their instructions were to counterattack if given the opportunity. If not, fall back to the last ditch and we'll fight it out there. And there was a win. So there was a win. And then immediately Foch, who was pictured in one of y'all's slides earlier, took advantage of it and said he declared the offensive for the Second Battle of the Marne. These guys moved by train back through Paris, got back down to Le Fert near Chateau Thierry, rested there for a couple of days, got this order to go forward to Croisilles Farm, to fight this battle at Croisilles Farm. The order was conceived by a French army commander, and it was a very interesting development. The second corps, the 42nd, the 167th was in the second corps of a French army. That corps command changed while this battle was unfolding. So these guys get up there and they get into position at Croisilles Farm. Now that is Croisilles Farm, ladies and gentlemen. the remnants of that big farmhouse are out there today. Everything else is exactly like you see it. There's crops today. That road you see, that tree line in the back, nothing changes in France. But for some reason, that 3.5 acres was just out there. And I knew when I saw that thing, I said, this is it. This is what I've been waiting for. And there it is. And there was the bloodiest day in Alabama history next to Gettysburg. It was an amazingly short fight. It didn't last max 4.5 hours. It was raining all day. It was cold. Will said he saw MacArthur about 11 o'clock that morning. That was MacArthur's way. He, like any good general officer, was going to get onto the ground and see it. Might not see it for long. That was one of the things I learned in Korea. I'd go for 3 weeks without ever seeing a major, but you're apt to see a major general. A good major general is going to come up there and kick some tires. He wants to know what's going on. But these majors are not going to take those chances unless they kind of have to. So anyhow, the assault kicks off at 5:40 that afternoon. 2 battalions in the assault. Everett Jackson's now in the reserve, so he gets his day off. He's got about 700 men back there. The other 2 have got a little better than 600 men in each of the battalions. Major Carroll from Ozark has got 1st Battalion. Major Smith from Opelika's got 3rd Battalion. They're supposed to kick off simultaneously by the clock. There was no radio communication. There was no wire communication. There were no pyrotechnics. Everything was by the watch. And so they don't kick off quite precisely as they should. The 1st Battalion just gets decimated. Julian Strasburger, Captain Julian Strasburger, young, brilliant lawyer from Montgomery here, Jewish guy. He gets killed in the first 5 minutes. My old man got hit twice. It's amazing, he got hit in the leg, didn't break the leg. And so he pulls himself into a hole. He said there's a dead German in there and a Frenchman is alive, and they're sitting there, and all of a sudden the attack just stopped. The battlefield went quiet. Nobody was shooting. The assault, the 1st Battalion assault had failed. The 3rd Battalion assault followed it about 5 or 10 minutes later, and it spun out. Screws says in his notes, in his literature later, that the regiment was essentially lost. And that Espy, Espy is the guy on the left, Robert Espy. Some of you may know Joe Espy. He's a street fighter lawyer here in this town now. And that's his great uncle. And the guy on the right, Gay, will you stand? Gay, this is his granddaughter. Those are bona fide combat officers, folks. They're the real deal. The attack had failed. It stopped. Before it started, in a meeting, Screws told Mortimer Jordan, who was arguably the best educated person in the regiment, to stand behind the 1st Battalion and to organize any casualties or any counterattacks that were going to take place. Well, it didn't take, the thing was, clearly at 5-10 minutes max, the battle was over. Screws said later, Espy saved the regiment. Those were his words. Jordan gave him 50 men and gave 50 men to a guy named Ernest Bell from Bessemer, Another first lieutenant, Ernest Bill, never got, I think Ernest Bill was one of those great people in the United States Army who's a hell of a good combat platoon leader, but not good for much else. They never used him for anything except assaults. I mean, he didn't know fire would burn. So Bill gets 50. Bill gets 50 men, and Espy gets 50 men, and that counterattack, by my reckoning, didn't last more than 15 minutes. They bolted across that open field. You saw a picture of it there with the farmhouse. They bolted across that open field, killing everything that moved, using the bayonet. One of the officers from Opelika said it's the first hand-to-hand fighting he'd ever seen in Europe. It was hand-to-hand fighting, the bayonet, the butt of the rifle. They were killing everything that moved, no mercy. And Will told me that while this was going on, that this French guy who was in the hole with him said, put your head up and see if what the Boche is doing. And Will says, no, you do it. He stuck his head up and took a bullet in his head. I mean, this was real stuff. And so anyhow, it was over in 15 minutes, and the whole tide of battle changed. And that was when Shorty Wren, the guy on the right, he was a sergeant. There were 4 mortars, there were like 81s that the regiment had. 3 of them had been knocked out somehow, not brought into action, and Wren had one of them. He got it to bringing up on the right flank and bring up enough ammunition, and you had to hand carry this stuff, and it's heavy. But he got enough rounds of ammunition up there that he made a difference. He started pouring that mortar to the Germans on the right flank, and all of a sudden they evaporated and the battle was over. 4.5 hours is up. 162 guys dead from Alabama, 283 dead Germans, 68 dead Iowans. More than 500 bodies, more than 500 dead bodies lying around that farmhouse. And that was, then the next morning, they had 1,000 casualties. 1,000, regimental aid station was pumping them out all night long. And they were moving forward, getting them back to better treatment. The next morning, the brigade commander came up, met with Screws, told Screws, you take your reserve battalion, you get down to the Ark River, it's 6 miles away. Tomorrow morning, you're going to jump off, you're going to cross the Ark River, you're going to climb the heights of the Ark, and you're going to fight another battle tomorrow morning on the heights of the Ark. And that was when, what's that guy's name, Joe? Everett Jackson. That's when Everett Jackson brought the reserve battalion up and took them over the next morning, crossed. The Ark River really wasn't much of a river. They waded across it and then went into the assault about 8 o'clock that morning, and that was when Sidney Manning who was in G Company from Ozark. He was really from Escambia County, been born in Butler County, guy who represented all of South Alabama, really. Anyhow, he won his Medal of Honor. He was the first person in the Rainbow to win the Medal of Honor, and he did it in great acts of glory. I can go on at this forever. I'm not going to put you through it, but let me tell you, they went about 6 weeks later, 5 weeks later, they went into the battle at Saint Maël. My old man said he still had scabs on his wounds, but he hadn't broken any legs. He'd been in a hospital in Paris, and they just cleaned the hospital out because they had a lot of rookie soldiers there. We was getting 30,000 new soldiers a month coming in, but they'd never done anything. They didn't know how to fight. And so everybody who could walk that had any previous experience was pulled out and thrown into the battle at Saint Maël, and it was pretty much an easy battle, although Captain Green of M Company was killed that day. And Alabama always got its fair share of casualties every time, I can tell you that. And dropping back to Croisilles Farm and the Ark, Second Battle of the Marne, the 4 regiments in the Rainbow Division, the Alabama Regiment had 1/3 of the casualties. And the Rainbow Division had more casualties than anybody in the Second Battle of the Marne. I said, then they go and drop into the Argonne. I'm not going to tell you that whole Argonne story. It's a fabulous story. I'm 25,000 words into another book on it, and I love writing it, except I'm having to do a lot of hard work to do it. But it's a great, great story. It's a 1st Division story. And then the 1st Division, which is arguably the best division the United States Army had probably ever in all time. It was so great, and it had won the first battle we really won in France at Cantigny, those first division guys call it, and that was when it was headed by Bullitt. By that time, Bullitt had become a division commander. He'd given him the hot stick, and Bullitt knew that if he failed, see, the French had taken Cantigny twice before, and the Germans counterattacked. And Pershing told Bullitt, you go in there and take Cantigny. And Bullitt said he knew that if he failed and failed on a counterattack, that his career was over. So he was successful at Cantigny, and that's when then they get on into the end of the battle at Argonne Forest, and it's the Alabama Regiment's greatest achievement of all time, which is when it won that battle at Côte de Châlillon. They'll kick me out of the club here if I talk much longer. So I'm not going to give you that story. Just read my next book. Well, it pretty well gets told in this book, though. It's a great, great story, and that was on the 16th of October, and guess what? On the 11th of November, it was all over. And I would like to, this is a great picture of MacArthur and Colonel Baer. He was the executive officer of the 167th. Screws had the flu. That was the only operation Screws ever missed, was the big one. I said, that's tough luck, you know. I mean, he was sick, and he just couldn't do it. And then this is the homecoming here in Montgomery. And let's go on. I want to see that picture. This is when Guru came to Montgomery in 1923. These are 4 of Montgomery's ladies. Joe could tell you exactly who they are. This is taken at the Montgomery Country Club, and he brought with him the French Legion of Honor and presented it to Bill Screws on behalf of the soldiers of the 167th Infantry Regiment. This is a picture. I'm going to end right here, but this is Pershing and Bullitt. That's Bullitt in that fur coat, and I mean Bullitt is he's the unsung hero of Alabama. I mean nobody knows who Robert Lee Bullitt was. And there he beats the Germans at Cantigny. He becomes an army commander. He becomes a 3-star general. He was the highest ranking Alabamian in the war. And we all know about Espy, and we all know about these other guys that are such great combat soldiers, but he was the one who climbed the ladder the highest. Thank you so much for your attention.